In the last video, we saw how we set up our servers on Hetzner using Terraform, and in this video, we will actually set up our basic k3s Kubernetes cluster. We will not yet install next.js, but we will have everything done. We have an integration to Hetzner as well. We will create a load balancer, and we will also have Lens as a UI to see what is actually happening in our cluster on our local machine. So all of that in this video. Stay tuned and let's go. Okay, so the first thing that we would need to do is we need to set up our servers again, Terraform apply. So this is something that we covered in the last video, how to basically use Terraform to set up your servers, and the servers are there. From that we get the Ansible production inventory file. This is this one, so this is the IPs of our actual servers. And the first thing that we would want to do now is we want to actually init the server. So the important part here is this one basically. So we use Ansible playbooks in order to access the server. So this would just shush on the server and then execute those tasks. And the important one is this one. You want to init the cluster using k3s. This downloads a file and then it executes a shell script and passes some commands or some configuration here. And the important configuration here is the cluster init. And that's also the reason why we only run this on server 0. So even if you would have multiple servers, you would still just run this one at first on one to init the cluster. Also very important is to have the cluster token being set. That is coming from Ansible Vault, and the Ansible Vault, that is something that is in the production folder as well. So here we have the secrets. As you can see, the Ansible Vault is encrypted. So you would pass a cluster token. The cluster token you can, or at least I always do it, using something like this. So for example, OpenSSL random hack 16, and there you get it. And then you use that as a secret in your Ansible Vault. And another thing that is very important is to disable traffic. So we will use traffic later on as our ingress controller later on, but you have to disable it first because you will install and activate it with some special variables later on to integrate well with Hetzner, but we will see that later on. We also already go ahead and install Helm, because Helm is something that you would need later on to manage your Kubernetes cluster or install interesting applications there. So let's go ahead and do it. So we go into our Ansible folder. Some things that I did here also is I created a vault password file. So this one is not being added to our GitHub. This is the vault password in order to decrypt the secrets file. That actually needs to be happening when you run the Ansible script in order to access those variables here. So for example, as we saw, the cluster token is something that is specified in the secrets. You can just look into that as well. If we do Ansible Vault, for example, edit and then production secrets, as we can see here, we just have the cluster token in this yet, but there will be more. And then another thing that you need to do is you create the Ansible config and basically say, okay, so here's the vault password. Of course, you don't need to do that. You can also always enter the vault password when you do use Ansible, but yeah, for me, it's a bit more convenient to do it like this. Obviously, there might be security considerations that might lead you to take a different approach. But for me, this is more than good enough. But just make sure that the vault password obviously will not be committed to your GitHub repository. Okay, so next what we want to do is we want to execute the Ansible playbook here. And we use the production inventory. And then we run the playbook k3s, which is 01 init the server. And we need to specify the extra vars because we use the var env in our script. So as we could saw here, we use env, for example, in order to specify what secrets we want. So if we have our staging and interact with that using Ansible, we can specify the env staging. So we use production, and then let's go ahead and execute this. Okay, as we can see, everything was executed, stuff was happening, and all should be good. So there is another playbook that I will add to the code, which is for join servers. So if you have more than just one server, you can add those. And remember, server, this means actually like the master nodes in your Kubernetes cluster. It's not specifically the nodes that would join, that run your pods or your workload. But these are special servers like the brains of your Kubernetes cluster. And if you want to have multiple of those, which we won't have in this tutorial, you can do it like this. You can run this specific playbook, but then you need to make sure that you use all servers but server 0, because that you already used in order to init your Kubernetes cluster. And then as you can see, the init flag is not provided here, but what you would have is, for example, private IPs of the main server that you need to specify. So it's a little bit different, but mostly the same. So where it gets a bit more interesting is we want to copy the kubectl config file. And this config file specifies how you can access your Kubernetes cluster. And we need that config file locally because we want to use an application to access and view all the things happening in our Kubernetes cluster. And the app that I'm using for that is Lens. It's free. You can just download it and use it. I will show you how we set that up in order to see if our cluster is actually already alive. So since the config will be loaded from our server 0 and it will be stored in a .cube file here, so make sure that you created that .cube file first, and then we will run the playbook to get that as well. So this one is the 03, and let's run it. Okay, it was copied, so maybe let's have a look how it looks. So as we can see, there is some IP information, some certificate information, which obviously is a secret, so make sure not to commit that to GitHub. Those are obviously only for the demo cluster and will be not available anymore once the video was uploaded. So in order to access our cluster with Lens, what we need to do first is we need to create an SSH tunnel, and I created a script for that called create tunnel. We pass the environment, which is production, and then what it does, it looks up the IP in our production inventory of server 0, so basically this one, and then it just creates a tunnel. This is nothing complicated, but the scripts help a little bit and make things easier. So it takes the environment, looks into the Ansible, and then it uses the Ansible server 0, and then it basically just creates a plain tunnel and forwarding the IP of our Kubernetes controller 6443. That's all it does. And it did it already. So now we are ready to use Lens and our kubectl or kubeconfig. So in Lens, what you would do is you would create a new local kubeconfig. So you press plus and then you select the config. I did that already and renamed it from default to next.js demo. And now what you can do is you can just connect. And then once you connect it, we can, for example, look into the nodes. So the nodes are not the workloads, but the actual servers. And as we can see, we already have our production k3s server 0 here. It has the role of the control plane and etcd and master. So everything is fine. We have the version of our Kubernetes cluster here. So that looks already good. So we actually have now the first node in our Kubernetes cluster, which is already quite a great achievement. So we are not ready yet to enter or to add our worker nodes, but what we still need to do is further continue our setup. So two things that we want to have is the hcloud cloud controller manager. So this is a cloud controller manager for Kubernetes. So basically in Kubernetes, you can create cloud controller manager, and the cloud that we are using obviously is hcloud, so the Hetzner cloud. And there is a package for Kubernetes to integrate with hcloud. And what this, for example, will be doing is when we create our Kubernetes cluster, we add some ingress controller. It will automatically for us create the Hetzner load balancer, which is pretty amazing. And the second thing that we want to have is the CSI driver. And this is the container storage interface. So this is basically a default from Kubernetes. And there is an implementation also for Hetzner Cloud. And then what this allows us is if we create, for example, an application within our Kubernetes cluster that needs some storage, then we can just configure it in our Kubernetes configuration. But then Kubernetes, with the use of the CSI for Hetzner Cloud, will automatically create the storage for us. So this is also pretty amazing in terms of the integration for our Hetzner Kubernetes cloud. So now let's set this up. And as usual, we have Ansible playbook for that. And we also, again, only install or configure our Kubernetes cluster using our server 0. So we need some more secrets that we will generate. We need to specify the kubeconfig environment variable. And then what we do is we use Helm to add some repos. That's why we had to install Helm already. So we add the hcloud charts, and then this is typically what you do. You add some repo, then you update it, and then what you would also do is just to check if our hcloud secret exists. And then when it does not exist, we add it. So basically what we need to do is we need to add the hcloud token in to our Ansible vault so that it can access it here. And then our hcloud token will be stored in our Kubernetes cluster as a secret. Because obviously our hcloud integration of our Kubernetes cluster needs to be able to interact with our hcloud account, and that's been happening with the hcloud token. And then here we will install the hcloud controller manager as well as the hcloud CSI interface. So this is what we want to do. So for that, first we need to actually enter our hcloud token. So we will first Ansible vault and then edit production secrets. And then we will add our key here, which is the hcloud token. And then we can just take this one from our Terraform vars. This one, which is secret as well. So I just entered it, store it, and then we should be good to go to set up the integration of our cluster to Hetzner. Okay, so we want to run this playbook. As we can see, the playbook ran. We have an error here. That was just that the secret does not exist yet, so we ignore that error. But since it did not exist, we will add the secret to our hcloud token. So everything ran. And one thing that we can check to verify if it worked, we can look into Lens. And then in Lens, we still see our server is running. But if we look into storage and then we look into the storage classes, what is new now is we have hcloud volumes as a storage class. And that's provided by our CSI Hetzner.cloud integration. So this looks pretty good. Everything seems to work as we would want to have it. Finally, we can join our agents to our cluster, and we do have a playbook for this as well, of course. And what this does is basically just installing k3s on the agent servers here, all of them together. And then one thing that is a bit different, which is important, is that we specify the main server IP address, and we do this via a config. So for that, we created a group vars folder. So basically that means whenever you run something on the agents, we also have access to these group vars, and the private IPs of the main server is 10. And this is how we set it up in our Terraform. So whenever we create our servers, they all start with 10 and then count upward. Obviously, then that means that our server 0 starts with 10, and that's the one we want to join our servers against. So we go ahead and just run this playbook. So the playbook ran, everything looks good, and now let's look into Lens and see if it actually worked. As we can see, our agent joined the cluster just recently. They are ready and everything is going very smoothly. So we already have our Kubernetes cluster set up. It's integrated with Hetzner, and there are just a few things missing in order to finally have our cluster being able to be used. Okay, so the final thing that we need to do in order to have our cluster prepared for our later usage for next.js, to have basically the very basic stuff done, is we need to set up our ingress. As I said earlier, we are not installing our ingress controller traffic right from the beginning. So we did not install it when we installed k3s, so to say, but we will install it now. And that's because we need to do some specific configuration. And of course, we have our playbook for that. And what we will do is we will copy some configuration, like the production traffic values, onto the server, again server 0, only the one that we will use to configure our cluster. And then we will add traffic again. So we add the repo, we update the repo, and then we install traffic, and we use the configuration. We add it to the namespace traffic, and then we also say, okay, create a namespace if it does not exist. So let's have a look into the global, into the production traffic values. So those are the configurations that we would set up. And we have web, secure, ingress router, and so on. So yeah, basically there are some things that you want to configure. And the one that is important, and also the main reason why we did not install it from the get-go, is that we want to enable the Hetzner load balancer. And you can configure some values here. So for example, the location, this is Nuremberg, which is in Germany, but I guess you can also use something in the US. And this is important. So basically what happens now is, once we set up the ingress controller, thanks to our integration with the Hetzner cloud, this will automatically create our Hetzner load balancer for us. One thing that we cannot set yet is this one, because this is the IP address of the load balancer in Hetzner. Since we did not create the load balancer yet, we don't have it. But it is kind of important to set that afterwards, because if you don't, you will see some not ideal behavior later on when we use argoCD, because Argo would then not be able to verify that, for example, an app was properly deployed if you don't specify that. So this is something that we will do later in the process. But for now, let's set up our ingress controller. And for those who don't really know what the ingress controller is, basically the ingress controller is nothing more like a proxy into your Kubernetes. So whenever you talk about ingress, you can imagine it like a reverse proxy, Nginx, traffic, whatever, and you use it. You can configure it in a way that you say, for example, if you have an app, you configure an ingress controller so that it basically forwards some specific traffic from some specific domain, for example, to your app inside your Kubernetes cluster. That's what ingress basically does. And the ingress controller we are using is traffic, which is basically just a reverse proxy. So now let's install that and see what is happening. All right, so everything ran through smoothly, so things should be now installed. Let's have a look first into Lens, what happened. So in Lens, what we can see now, if we go into the workloads, we should go to the overview. We see there are no pods and nothing, but that's only because we are now looking into the default namespace. What we can see here are some namespaces already. The one that is new, obviously, is traffic. And then if we look here, we can see 2 pods. So actually, traffic is running on 2 pods, which is pretty awesome. And then another thing that happened or should have happened, we look into next. So let's look into our Hetzner cloud. So obviously we have the servers, but if we go now into the load balancer, what we can see is pretty amazing. We actually created a load balancer, and as you saw, it just turned healthy. And this was all done automatically by our Hetzner integration of our cluster. And if we look into this, so we have 4 targets being there, and the targets obviously are our cloud servers, which are our agents in our server. So all that stuff was set up for us automatically, which is absolutely amazing. So now we do have the basics of our cluster done. So in this video, we achieved a great step ahead to host our next.js cluster on Kubernetes. We basically have our cluster running. We also did set up the integration to Hetzner. We have a load balancer in front. We have our agents. So that's pretty amazing. We also have access to it locally using Lens, so we see what's actually happening. And if you like that so far and are interested how we set up the final cluster, make sure to subscribe. The next video will be out soon. And yeah, I hope you liked the video. So press like, subscribe, and see you in the next one.